I came to know Wolf through workshops in Australia, and my first workshop was just after the first passing workshop held in Adelaide in early 80s. And I didn't go to that workshop, but my boss did. And as soon as she came back, I was hearing the name Wolfensberger. I'd heard the name with respect to normalisation. But then I started doing workshops. And of course, my first workshop was a pass workshop, pass 3. And of course, being the main author of that evaluation tool. So I got to hear about Wolf and started to read his articles and then pursue more. And it was a revelation. There was a sense there was a gut feeling I had that things weren't right in services. And I didn't know how to put it into words, but Wolf nailed it. In a sense, he named the problem, and with such fine and exquisite analysis that was breathtaking. And so I was very excited. I became quite radicalised by what I was learning. I thought, here is the language, here is the evaluation of the problem that we see and we're surrounded by. But not only that, there was a sense of what would a service need to look like that truly met people's needs. So it not only described the problem very well, but also then proposed the solution. And in that sense, it was empowering, because rather than kind of hedge around what is the problem here, what do we do about this, and the typical reflexive modes of people, oh, we should do this, or we should have rights, or we should, just better carpet or something, like low-level responses, a kind of chaotic response to it. It was like, here was something that was systematic, detailed, and left no stone unturned. And in that sense, it was so very valuable. And I was so thirsty. I wanted to know more. And it was kind of insatiable. Enormously creative, but a problem solver. I think his analysis was breathtaking. His ability to see various events and then to be able to predict the kind of results that would bring, even in far removed ways. When I worked later, I went and studied at the Training Institute with him and with the other trainers attached to the Training Institute. I was really taken aback by his ability to connect what we would see as disparate or even separate phenomena, and he could see connections between them. And I don't think I've ever met someone with the kind of intellectual ability. I would take evaluation results of 42 ratings and across competency and image and all these scores, and he'd be able to look at a score sheet, and he hadn't even seen the service, and he'd be able to pick up where various scores were incorrect, because you couldn't have that score when you've got this score. And for me, they were miles apart. Now, I'm better at that now, but he was masterful. He was a master at being able to see the interrelationship between phenomena and to see the likely effect of that. What was interesting, though, was to see that other people didn't like him being able to do that, to make predictions that they didn't like hearing that news. They wanted to think that their systems, their efforts were going to be utopian, and he'd come along and say, this is deeply flawed because of these things, and it can't produce the things that you say it will. And so they didn't particularly, their sense was that people were antagonistic, because in a sense he wasn't a believer in what they believed in, because they hadn't done the analysis. And his ability to do that, I've never met anyone with that level of capacity. Well, you might say people who had simplistic solutions would have been unhappy with a more detailed analysis. People who are more ideologically driven, and by an ideology, a sense of that believing in something is true, will make it true, and therefore anyone that brings an empirical analysis to that, therefore, as it were, uncovers the falseness of the ideology. And of course, ideologies touch on what people believe or what they believe to be true. And therefore, having someone blow your bubble up on that and expose the falseness, expose a false hope. And he would always name that if he wrote articles and so on. But you got the sense that the articles weren't necessarily well received. So sometimes they might have been system people, they might have been bureaucrats, they might have just been people who in training or various movements. So movements, Wolf would call them crazes, and that crazes would sweep across the human service field rapidly, and that there'd be one craze after another. And so many of these crazes were kind of low-level solutions to very complex problems. And of course, by the very nature of the solution, it wasn't going to deal with, in fact, could even exacerbate, because it didn't take into account human nature. Wolf's understanding of human nature was also without parallel. He had a very good understanding of the capacity of human beings for good and evil, and the conditions that would be needed for people to be at their best. And he could see too that many of the glib solutions to very deep social problems were bound to be, because they didn't take into account the uncertainty, the untrustworthiness. Much like Milgram's study, you just can't rely on human nature to do the right thing under malevolent leadership. And Wolf understood those dynamics very well indeed. But people didn't want him to necessarily tell them that. Well, you know, you have to be a believer of the news, and even if it's not true. He would deconstruct. He would show the emperor has no clothes. People sometimes had invested deeply in what had been quite shallow thinking, both about what the problem was like and what the solution would be needed to fix it, and would in a sense, be just another ideological craze that was founded on emotion, but very little empirical evidence for it, and without really very clear conditions for what it would require and the kind of sustainability. So you see Wolf's emphasis on the need for leadership, and leadership that was both driven ideologically, with, in a sense, with positive values about people, but they also knew what to do, so that they weren't just bleeding heart type leaders, they were leaders who had strategic ability, and therefore the ability to observe reality. And you might say the evaluation tools really taught us to observe what is going on and what will its impact be on the people being served, and to be under no illusion as to what that is like and what it would take to change it. So it's interesting that much of his training, and I and my wife, we did a tour 2 years ago looking at change agents and successful change agentry through the US and Canada. And time again, we met people who'd now been working in these change roles for more than 20 years, 25 years plus. And all of them began to say, oh yeah, I did that early past workshop. It just opened my eyes, and it also radicalized my intention. It made me see the problem so clearly, and I had to do something about it. And time again, Wolf was at the basis of that, and his analysis. Now, some of them didn't stay with Wolf, but they could all say that's where it started. He was the man who, you know, pulled the trigger that, you know, changed my thinking and made me see things I'd not seen before. Much a repeated story. Because normalisation, in a sense, provided the rationale for what a service might look like other than the ones we already had. The normalisation period, of course, was very much within the institutional period. The mistake that was made, of course, that we discovered later, is that the idea was that the institution was the evil, and that if you were to basically deconstruct the institution brick by brick, then you would have removed the evil. But of course, as people moved into better settings, we found that some of the results were disappointing, that some of the service practices of the past followed people, and the culture of the past followed people into, sure, the grouping was a bit smaller, and there was potential for greater individualisation, but not always borne out. And it was therefore in the period of SRV from normalisation, having to see that there was something else at the heart of this that needed to respond. And that's where the clarity about devaluation and wounding emerged, the clarity about heightened vulnerability, and the clarity about the centrality of valued social roles that was the true, you might say, the tipping point. Normalisation, though, was like, I typify it as being like a scattergun or a shotgun, multiple pellets, but you don't know which ones really make the difference. So so what you look like, what you do, where you go, who you're with, and so on, and you just have to address all of that. Whereas SRV was able to target it. If you get the valued social role, everything else flows from that. So now this is the thing that would really make the difference. And in a sense, that's been quite a revolution for SRV, I think, over normalisation, is that it provided a sharpening of what the real issue is that changes the way the observer sees and understands another person. You can do all these things, but unless the person gets a valued social role, then the observer is not going to interpret this person in a more valued way. Normalisation didn't have that kind of... It had all many of the impacts were in place, but not the higher order kind of cause for it. Where would you need to start that would make the difference and would really flip it over, where a person who was formerly devalued could be seen as a valued person and, in a sense, automatically treated well? And in a sense, to answer your question, that's a continuing journey. It's being borne out now in the lives of individual people. And we've got many, many examples now that we wouldn't have seen back in the 70s and early 80s, where we'd never seen people live in their own home. We'd never even seen people live in a group home in the early 80s in Australia. We'd never even imagined that that was possible, because we'd only ever seen people living in wards and units and transported on buses and being... And so to imagine, wow, a person living in their own place and a person having a job, we'd not seen it before, so it was even hard to imagine. Whereas now we see that. Now, still though, the proportion of people who get to truly experience that is still far too low. So you might say there are leading edge people who are getting a good life now. We've got good evidence on the board. But percentage-wise, my guess is it's about 3% of people. 97% of people still have very much a managed life, congregated or segregated life. And while there are improvements and their service would score a bit better, they're not necessarily into the positive area. So there's still a long way to go for the vast number of people. And part of the problem now is that people are using the language, person-centeredness, valued social role, individualisation, but the evidence in people's lives has got a far... In fact, at the same time, we've got bureaucratic systems that are insisting on greater regulation, greater policy adherence, greater compliance, and therefore everything's being locked down into policy and de-individualising people just as rapidly as they're being individualised. In a sense, the 80s was a very radical and exciting period where change was now expected, and it was like everybody wanted to join the bandwagon. What we saw as bad was universally seen as bad. There were very few people, well, there were some, but very few people who were saying, please keep the institutions open because we think they're a great idea. What we don't see today, though, is people saying, going off to your respite centre and going off to your segregated bowling team and going off to a day program all day, and no one's saying that they're a bad thing. In fact, we don't know what else to do for a large number of people. And in a sense, there are other agendas that play out in a service, of course, and other models that begin to impact, and these non-programmatic issues of the way funding is delivered, the control of the funder now that's much greater than it had been in the 80s and 90s. And so this increasing regulation, and so people have drawn away from the programmatic area. Who are the people? What do they need? What would it take to deliver an impeccable service? And much more compliance around, do we have paperwork, ISO, 9000 or whatever number it might be, which mainly is about compliance of paperwork, HR procedures, OH&S, these kind of things. And it's like the integrity of the service now is being captured by these non-programmatic provisions that are then imposed on families and people's lives. And whereas some service realise that we need a bureaucratic shield, whereas other services, they've completely engaged with the corporate mindset. We are a company, we are a business, and we need now to run ourselves with, levels of hierarchy and reporting and paperwork, but create a facade and use the language, the glamour associated with good lives, even the language of the good life. It's very much been engaged now, and it's been taken up. And at one level, that's great. Now we know what the purpose is. But it's a claim now, much like being best practice, that doesn't necessarily get borne out. So it's like what the problem is no longer quite so clear. people are listening now to what appears to be the rhetoric and are feeling satisfied and let down. So there's not a driving force, and therefore the leadership to again name the problem and to recommend the proper solution to it. It's been hijacked by these other matters. And sometimes you see people give up and say, this is the best we can do, you have to make the most of what you've got, and feel rather defeated by all of that. The other thing, of course, is right that the change agents of the 80s and 90s are now getting older and retiring. And we don't always have younger people who are coming up radicalised and clear with the technical know-how. There might be an ideological push, but people don't know how to create change. And it'll be, I guess, to be seen whether they'll have the going power, the resilience. I mean, even the workshops Wolf designed, he believed would help prepare someone for the kind of challenges that leadership would bring them. Late nights, clear thinking, being able to separate one issue from another, and being able to do that under duress. I mean, he had a style of training that was almost like the SAS might get, the Green Beret, where you put under duress, so let's not eat, let's not sleep, and then let's still win under those conditions. It was almost like that, and people kind of deride Wolf a bit. Had us staying up to midnight. But he said, if you're going to be a change agent, these are basic requirements. Your capacity to be able to work and continue to think and do so under pressure and not crack up. And today where are those kind of leaders? There are some out there, but as a social movement, it just has a very different feel to it, to the old days when I was starting, and the excitement that brought is just not there. I probably share some of Wolf's pessimism about the future and of human nature and society, the pressures of society and of the world, some of the major global problems, the economies, the ecology of the world, just basic things like pestilence and lack of food, and all of these pressures will mean that devalued people are going to be in a lot of trouble. The other aspect, of course, is that the service system is not the place to protect people ultimately. The greatest safeguard is going to be relationship. And it's to be seen whether the relationships can be formed between valued and devalued people to the extent that would protect people. To rely on the system, it controls people's lives, but it can't love people like families can, like good friends can. And therefore it's much more potential for abandoning people. When other priorities arise, valued people will be looked after first, and devalued people will be jettisoned in terms of their needs. And therefore, if things do continue to get bad, it's really only personal relationships that will pull us through, probably pull us all through, and rather than a reliance on systems in some way to protect it. The very complexity of the system today just means it'll break down very rapidly. You only have a loss of power and computers are completely shut down. It's much more fragile in its complexity. And so to think that will rescue us all and rescue devalued people when it's really commitments, personal commitments. And there will be people in the system who carry those commitments. But the system as a whole is going to be committed to its own survival, way ahead of the survival of the people it serves. And so that's a pretty grim kind of outlook. And some would say too pessimistic. People say you've got to be optimistic to have hope. Wolf would say, yes, but you have to have a hope that's realistic. You don't want a false hope. False hopes just disappoint people. They lead to a dismay because what you hoped in was shown to be false. So he always had this realistic edge, and even people who love him and love SRV have had trouble with his worldview about the future and have struggled with it, and because of the overly pessimistic, what they would regard as a pessimistic perspective on that. People don't want to look at the evidence, and he's done many papers on the signs of the times, and through the years he's updated that and what he's seen happening that's good in the service system and what doesn't work, these kind of things. One of the things I loved about Wolf, though, was his quirky humour, his personality. He came into this training institute one day and he said, there are students down there everywhere just sitting around doing nothing. And they could be up here working for me. Ha ha! And then they'd walk off laughing. And we go, what? And he was just a very funny man and a beautiful man to be around because of that humour. But and then he could come out with something just so profound that it'd just leave us stunned and you never forget it. Amazing.